Okay, so the UK is one of the leading democracies in the world, but have you ever asked yourself, how democratic actually is it? Let's talk about it. Now, I thought it would be good to start today with some statistics. So according to YouGov, 3/4 of Britons, 75%, describe the UK as a democratic country. That's obviously a good thing. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting because 6 in 10, 60%, complain that they don't feel like they can say what they think freely. And this is the more shocking part for me. Over 34% feel like they have no say when it comes to how things are run. This is clearly a problem because if we are this leading democracy, how come people don't feel like they have a say in how things are going? So the question I want to ask really is democracy working in the UK? Now, most people, and a lot of people around the world, will probably say that the UK is the mother of democracies. It's one of the leading democracies in the world. And there are certain elements of our democracy that works really, really well. But according to the public and this YouGov survey, it looks as though certain parts aren't working for people. Now, some of you may be quite shocked by this news because you say, hold on a minute, Mike, we have elections. I voted for a prime minister not too long ago. We have all these pressure groups. We have campaigning groups. I mean, we even elect police commissioners. You might be thinking, there's lots of ways to get involved. So why don't people feel involved? Why do people feel powerless? Well, we can probably start with some of the key things that's happened over the past few years that have really shaken up the table, so to speak. I think our political dynamics have changed when you consider the Scottish referendum. That was a really big, seismic and decisive vote, but it also changed things. In 2016, when we had the EU referendum, again, that changed things quite a bit. Now, here's what's really interesting about YouGov and all these political happenings, because it says that 35% of people think that over the past 20 years, the UK has become less and less democratic. Really interesting. I remember my first tangible involvement with wanting things to go one way in the UK and things going a different way. Believe it or not, it was during the Iraq War. On the 15th of February 2003, anti-war protests, which was a day of coordinated protest around the world, broke out in over 600 cities. And what was happening across the world were people were coming out basically saying that they did not support the imminent war that was about to happen.
I mean, I think it's one of the few demonstrations where people really thought they could stop a war, and therefore they felt them turning out individually as opposed to reading about it in the newspaper or saying, oh, that's a good thing when they watched it on television.
According to BBC News, between 6 to 10 million people took part in protests in up to 60 countries around the world.
I can officially welcome you here to this city in the biggest political demonstration in 2,000 years of British history.
Folks, I mean, it was universally loathed, the idea that the UK and the US might go to war. Now, we all know how it ended. The war happened, and unfortunately, the voice of the people was simply not heard during that time. Now, 10 years later, and writer Ian Sinclair assembled what's called an oral history about the demonstration. Now, this is what journalist Ellie Mae O'Hagan said about what happened. He said, despite the size of the protest, it did absolutely nothing. People made a loud ruckus. They shared their perspectives in the UK and in all these countries around the world. And unfortunately, people didn't listen. When I say people, I mean people in power. Now, later on, the United Nations declared the act as an aggression, and they said it broke international law. So even though people had certain ideas, they made their thoughts known. It seemed like our political system just wasn't willing to hear the will of the people. Now, in many ways, 2003 was one of the first times I got involved in the political process, but you fast forward to not too long ago, and now we have another issue, different but similar. Again, another story that paints the difference between what people think and what they want to happen, and sometimes what it seems like the system does. And let's talk about, I don't know, the Windrush scandal. Now, for those who don't know, the Windrush generation are those that arrived in the UK from the Caribbean countries between 1948 and 1973. Many of them took jobs in the NHS and also just joined critical services here in the UK. Now, at the time, the Caribbean was part of the British Commonwealth, and so the people who arrived were automatically British subjects and free to permanently live and work in the UK. But under Theresa May, in 2017, the Windrush scandal began to come to light. It emerged that hundreds of Commonwealth citizens, many of whom were part of this Windrush generation, had been wrongly detained, deported, and denied legal rights. Now, there was widespread shock and outrage about this whole situation because what emerged was the fact that many Black Britons who had every right to be here had their lives devastated by the system, and it seemed as though our elected officials didn't do that much about it. Falsely deemed as illegal immigrants and undocumented migrants, many of them started losing their rights to housing, to healthcare, even to their bank accounts. Now, the public outcry was loud. Many just couldn't believe the stories they were reading.
How many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame.
How could our system allow such a miscarriage of justice? How could our elected officials do so little about the problem? Now, the scandal is still ongoing and many people are still waiting for justice. But, you know, I could carry on. These are just two examples that show us that oftentimes in our system, the will of the people is ignored because our system fundamentally needs to change. And so, even though the UK is heralded as one of the leading democracies in the world, there are clearly areas of improvement and things that are still yet to change. Sometimes the will of the people seem ignored, and sometimes you have to question whose interests are these systems really serving. As always, the solution is in part active citizens. I mean, it was a journalist that brought the Windrush scandal to light. We as citizens have to demand more from politicians and demand more from institutions. We have to hold them to account. But I want to know your thoughts. I want to know what you think about it. So let me know what you think in the comment section. I would love to hear your perspective.